So thank you all again for having me present on Tibetan Buddhist Mandalas. This is actually a lot of fun for me because this is a bit closer. Oh, is it better?
Yeah. Probably is better.
Okay.
Is that better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Don't have to yell too much. Okay. So yeah, this is a lot more fun for me. And so, well, I mean, I love the Hinduism, totally, and all about that. But this is more along the lines of what I research, what I explore, and so I'll actually be able to draw a little bit from my own experiences on this topic. And so today we're going to be talking about Tibetan Buddhist mandalas, and we'll, in the study later on, we'll look a little bit more at the sort of historical and surrounding Vajrayana context, very specific context in which mandalas as a practice developed. We'll do that for the study. For this one, I'll give a little bit of the history, just so you know where the idea of mandala came from. But for the most part, I want to show you the visual and symbolic natures of mandalas and their impact in terms of Buddhist meditation, why they're so valued in Tibetan Buddhist meditation. But they're not just found in Tibetan Buddhism, they're also found in Japanese Buddhism as well. There is some Vajrayana or tantric practice found in Japanese Buddhism. And so you will see some Japanese examples, not in this presentation, I'm sticking to Tibetan Buddhism, but just for your own fortification that you know that that's out there. Oh, as a little aside, speaking of Japanese Buddhism, that prayer or chant that you said, that we were all saying earlier, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, that is actually from a certain sect of Japanese Buddhism called Nichiren Buddhism that was founded by the founder Nichiren in the 13th century, and it's all about the Lotus Sutra. And so it literally means in the name of the Lotus Sutra. Hello? Hello?
It's working.
Is that okay? Okay, sorry. So what you're saying is in the name of the Supreme Dharma, Dharma meaning the Buddha's teachings, in the name of the Supreme Dharma, the Lotus Sutra. So that was just a little aside right there. Okay, talking about Tibetan Buddhist mandalas. We see right here already an example of one. I actually brought one today, for those who may have noticed it hanging up at the beginning or throughout the service today. I purchased this in Tibet about 6 years ago from the capital city of Lhasa. It's a very popular one. I kind of like it because it's very ornate. There's a lot of blues and golds in it. I believe it's a variant of the Kala Chakra mandala. There's a lot of different types of mandalas out there. There are hundreds of unique mandalas. Only a handful that you'll find time and time again. The Kala Chakra is one such mandala that the Dalai Lama will have ceremonies focused on. He'll even have the mandala, the Kala Chakra mandala, built, constructed out of sand or through paint as an offering to the world, usually as a means of bringing peace to the world, right? These kinds of things. So this is a representation of that. This is a very traditional Tibetan painting. It's called a tanka in Tibetan, a tanka. And you'll see tankas of various deities of the mandalas, as well as different wrathful protectors even. Right? You'll get that a lot in Vajrayana Buddhism. You'll notice there is a covering, and you might see that at the end when I start to put it up. There's a covering that covers it if it needs to be protected. But it also has these sort of like kind of banners that come down as an offering. And you'll also see what is called a kata in Tibetan, or a prayer scarf that is often hung around or near these tankas as an offering. It's kind of a representation of one's reverence towards the central deity of these images. And I'll talk about that as we get into it. But before, so that's just one example I think might be kind of intriguing. To give you a little idea of where the word mandala comes from, first of all, to set some context, there are three major schools of Buddhism in the world now. There's Theravada Buddhism, which is mostly practiced in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, all except Vietnam. There's Mahayana Buddhism, and that tends to be practiced in East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam as well is kind of included in that. And then there's Vajrayana Buddhism. And this is the third and youngest of the three schools of Buddhism in the world. This is mostly practiced in Tibet. Again, there's a little bit of it in Japan, but mostly it's in the Himalayas. You'll also see it in Nepal, as well as Bhutan, Ladakh, Sikkim. So again, just all along the Himalayan range. This is Vajrayana Buddhism. Has anyone heard of Vajrayana, the word before? Has anyone heard? Okay, you've heard it before.
Just I don't know anything about it.
But you've heard about it. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Has anyone heard the term tantric before? All right. In what context have you heard that word?
Sex.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Tantric sex. This has become, especially in the 60s and 70s. Sting was a big thing, right? He was all about tantric practices. So this is that school of thought, actually. However, the way that America has kind of co-opted that has sort of warped it a little bit. There is tantric sex in traditional Vajrayana practices, and if you're curious, we could talk about that during the study. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but I want you to know that's what we're looking at, is the tantric school of Buddhism. So it's called by these various names. It all refers to the same school. Vajrayana literally means the adamantine or indestructible vehicle, right? The vehicle that is indestructible. Mantrayana means the incantation vehicle. We've all heard of mantras, right? Maybe we pronounce it more like mantra in American English, but it's mantra, and it means just these magical formulas or incantations. And then the word tantric, which again has this sort of salacious connotation now, but the word is a lot more boring in origin. It actually just refers to a bibliographic designation. It just refers to a type of text, right? Called tantra. Tantras, these are texts. So it's in these texts that you find descriptions of mandalas, that you find these very elaborate visualization exercises that are meant to be what promotes the nuances and colors and geometric designs of these mandalas. You see just how ornate and geometric they are. That's part of the process. But I'll explain exactly why that is in a moment. Just to give you a little brief history lesson about where the idea of mandalas came from, it actually was political. The word itself, mandala, in Sanskrit means circle. That's it. Just means circle. Nothing more complex than that. But it's taking on a great deal of political connotation by the time we get to the 7th century in India, in North India, which is where Vajrayana Buddhism started. It was then adopted in Tibet about a century later. Okay? So what basically you have are all of these distinct Indian states. There was this big empire in India till the 6th century called the Gupta Empire, and then it fell. And suddenly you had all these individual little kingdoms all vying for power, all vying for control. And the relationship that they would share with each other was always in flux. And so for instance, you'd have one city-state, one kind of feudal realm that would be on top. It would be the military power in that region, and all the other nearby feudatory states would sort of kowtow to that central one, right? That one would be in control. And so you would have this kind of geometric pattern where one central power and then all these individual powers along the outskirts. Sometimes that would change, and then one of those outlying powers, those feudal states, would suddenly gain in power over the next couple of decades. It would suddenly be in the center, and the original power would then shrink to an outlying power. Right? So you'd have this constant fluctuation, and those were called mandalas. So it was very much a political structure to begin with. And that's exactly where we get the word. It's when Buddhists at that time co-opted that structure to represent all the various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, these beings of compassion and wisdom that are so prominently found in Mahayana Buddhism and certainly in Vajrayana Buddhism. That's when that symbol was brought in to represent those kinds of powerful relationships between these enlightened beings. Right? And then by extension, our relationship to those beings. Right? So not only the relationship between those beings, but also our relationship to those beings. So that's how mandalas became so popular. Where mandalas are most important is in this practice called deity yoga. Deity yoga. This is where you have all these types of meditations focused on mandalas in Tibetan, traditional Tibetan Buddhist practice. It's predominantly a monastic practice in its origins. So what you have in traditional Vajrayana philosophy or doctrine is that you can take the components of your very personhood, And usually it's represented by three elements: your body, your speech, and your mind. And you can transform them, you can transmute them, and change them into the enlightened body, speech, and mind of a tantric deity. So you're becoming enlightened by subsuming your identity into the identity of an already enlightened being. That's the whole point of tantric practice right there, is becoming an enlightened being by proxy, basically. And the way you would do that, there are three major practices that supplant your body, speech, and mind. Is that a hand? No? Gentleman in the back? Is that? I thought your hand was up. No? Okay. There are three ways, three practices that represent this supplanting of the body, speech, and mind. To supplant your body, you do these mudras, they're called. These are very unique hand gestures. And if you've ever seen Tibetan monks performing a sand mandala, which I'll show some pictures of, or any kind of ceremony, any kind of chanting, they're often also doing these very elaborate hand gestures in a very particular order. So that is changing your normal body into the movements of an enlightened being's body. Right? That's the symbolism there. For speech, it's mantras. And this happens to be the most famous mantra in all of Tibet. It says, Om Mani Padme Hum. Has anyone heard that before? Om Mani Padme Hum. Very, very popular. This is what all Tibetans say. It's dedicated to a specific bodhisattva named Avalokiteshvara. Very long name. It's a lot easier in Tibetan. His name is Chetazik in Tibetan. A little bit long and a little bit shorter. Either way, he's the bodhisattva of compassion. He is known for being very compassionate and for always answering one's prayers. And so that's exactly why Tibetans pray to him. So whatever deity you're trying to imitate through this process, you then also recite the speech of that deity, the mantra of that deity. And so now you've supplanted your speech with the speech of an enlightened being. Finally, there's the mind. And that's exactly what mandalas represent. They are the mind of an enlightened being. It's sort of a mental map. It's multiple things. A mandala has numerous symbols attached to it. So on the one hand, in this context, it is a mental map of an enlightened being. And the whole reason why you visualize it, and it's a very elaborate visualization process, it takes decades even to master by Tibetan monks, is that you are changing your mind to that of an enlightened being's mind. So now you've changed your body, your speech, and your mind into that of an enlightened being. You are therefore, by proxy, an enlightened being. Right? So that's where mandalas fit in the broader spectrum of Vajrayana practice, of tantric deity yoga. Right? The mandala is the mind of the enlightened being. However, that's not all it is. Again, it's a very multivalent symbol. So for instance, here's one such mandala of the Chakrasamvara Tantra. Very popular Tantra, a very popular figure in traditional Indian Vajrayana as well as Tibetan Vajrayana. You see how very ornate it is, but if you look closely, there's a little being in the center. Right? That's Chakrasamvara. Right? That's the deity, Chakrasamvara. All right? So the whole idea is to become one with that deity. And then it's also, you have this entire palace represented around. You have all these kind of fences, you might call them, like fences, all around them. You have 4 gates in the 4 cardinal directions, each one a different color, right? Blue, green, red, and yellow. And then you have on the outskirts all of these divine beings, all of these very wrathful and multi-armed deities right up here. And then you have different Buddhas right up at the top. And then you have all these other extra kind of divinities and mythical creatures all along the border. So it's a very elaborate world that's being constructed. What a mandala also is a palace. So it's not just a mental map of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva, it is a palace for that Buddha. They are at the center of it. And so you have all of these gates. And when monks meditate on a mandala, you can do it several different ways. One way is to view it as a palace from a bird's eye view, and you start at the outskirts, and you weave your way very circuitously closer and closer to the center. You enter through one gate, usually the eastern gate, and then you kind of circumambulate inside. This is all going on in your head. Right? You're visualizing circumambulating the inner gates And then you go further and further into the palace. You circumambulate further, further and further until you get to the center where the deity resides and you become one with the deity there. This is very indicative, even though this is all visual, this is all happening in your mind, very indicative of traditional Tibetan Buddhist practices of circumambulation physically, which is they will go to a sacred place, a sacred building, or a monastery, or temple, and first, especially if they're very devout, monks, as well as laymen and women, will circumambulate. They'll go clockwise around the sacred site. Then they'll enter into it, and they'll do the middle circuit, which is just inside, but not quite close to the center. And then finally, they'll go to the inner circuit, which is right around the central statue of that monastery or temple. So there's also a very physical representation of this process. So there's a mental and there's a physical. The other way that this is very indicative of the history of mandalas, remember what I said, how politically there was always a feudal state at the center and then these subsidiary states. You see that very well represented in an image like this. This is the Amitayus mandala. There's Amitayus, very popular deity for long life prayers at the center. But you notice all these other deities, not only in the cardinal directions, but in the ordinal directions as well, southeast, northeast, northwest. And so these are sort of these secondary deities of that mandala that you also want to visualize, that you also want to engage in this process of memorization. And that's exactly what monks do, monks and nuns, Tibetan monks and nuns. They memorize this mandala. Imagine, just try for a moment, looking at it as you are now. Now close your eyes and try to picture it as exactly detailed as it is. Can you see every nuance? Can you see the individual deities? Can you see the color of the fence all around the border, the blue kind of moat in between, the different colors of the gates? Do you remember the Buddhas in each of the corners? That's hard, isn't it? Right? At a glance. This is why monks and nuns, when they perform these visualizations, they're doing it daily, sometimes hours, and they're doing it over the course of years, if not decades. So that the idea, and the way this is described in one text on mandala visualization, is that they memorize it so thoroughly that a practitioner could see it in all of its detail, all of its nuance, all of its color, and exquisite geometry on the tip of their nose. A small little image on the tip of their nose with their eyes open. That the visualization is so burned into their mind that even with their eyes open, they could see it in all of its detail, this big on the tip of their nose. That's intense. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. So that's the whole point of these visualizations. Another way that practitioners can visualize this in a very popular way, you know, there's even a video that represents it, and I couldn't find it anywhere. I can't remember where it was, but I wanted to bring it if I could. But I'll explain it either way. In some mandalas, here's another example with the deity at the center, and then all subsidiary deities. You see all the different gates and all the different rooms that are kind of blocking the way. You kind of go room to room until you get to the center. One other way of visualizing a mandala is starting from the center and moving out. And in this way, what happens is the deity at the center is represented by what's called a seed syllable. It's a single syllable mantra that is very powerful and very primordial. And oftentimes, so to give you some examples, the syllable could be boom, one syllable, boom. It could be hi, one syllable. And this is represented in Tibetan writing. And so you'll see that initial seed syllable in the Tibetan, usually a certain color like white or yellow or green. And that'll represent the deity at the center. Then you'll see emanating from that all of the other deities on the outskirts, right? All of the secondary deities and their seed symbols. And then you'll see emanating further out. So it creates almost like a lotus petal. And that's kind of the point too. You see how it's sort of a lotus with about 8 petals. You'll see emanating out from that lotus of deities all the other rooms, all the other colors and channels that make up that mandala, until you have the entire palace, right, with the 4 gates right here. And then, it doesn't stop there, and then you'll envision the courtyards surrounding the palace. Right? That's what those represent. Then you'll see the moats and the fences, the indestructible fences that surround the moats. And from out further still, you'll envision all of the protector deities and tutelary tantric deities and Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that surround the mandala, as you see in this image. Some of them are so ornate, as in this case, that they also even have, aside from the different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas along the bottom, you'll see in the top register, those represent various lineage masters, the great teachers of the tradition from whence that mandala came, how it was passed down generation after generation. And so all these paintings of individual masters of the tradition. And you'll visualize it starting from the center and moving out, everything radiating from that central deity at the center. So that's another good example of that. You'll also have 3D mandalas. That's cool, isn't it? Because again, it's meant to be a palace, but in a 2D representation, as you see in the painting, in the taka over there, or as in the images I showed, it's all meant to be from a bird's eye view. But if you really want to get ornate, you can also have a lovely three-dimensional model. Now these are very modern examples. There are some really ancient ones, hundreds of years old, that are made of brass, that are just gorgeous. And again, I tried to find photos of that, I just couldn't in my collection. I don't know quite where I left them. I have a lot of photos. But these are pretty good representations. These are just modern examples, and they're much more colorful, much more ornate. But you see, it represents a palace. This, I think, is a bit more clear. With the 4 gates, with the entrance up to those gates, with the moats all around it, and then the fence further around that, representing different colored fire. All right? And then finally, presumably in the center, it's all sealed off, there's the central deity. All right, now the second half of this talk, I'm going to talk about Neichu Monastery. I don't know how much time we have left.
About 16 minutes.
Oh, I'm fine then. Okay, good. Yeah, I don't feel so bad. I'm going to take it slow. Okay, so the example I'm going to give you for the other half of this talk is all about a mandala, a sand mandala, that I observed being constructed from start to almost finish. I had to leave right before they had to destroy it. This took place at a monastery in Tibet called Neichu Monastery on the outskirts of Lhasa, on the outskirts of the capital city. Here's a picture of Neichu Monastery today. You can see it's quite modernized in terms of now they've got electricity. There are cars parked in front of it. And the monastery itself, I don't have enough time to talk about it, but were you to go inside, it itself represents a mandala. And this is actually very common in a lot of Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, where the monastery itself is a kind of a mandala. There is a deity, a central deity at the very holiest core of the monastery, and that's usually represented by a statue. Then, depending on the means of the monastery, the subsidiary deities will be represented also by statues, usually smaller statues, or by murals along the walls of the inner sanctum. And then there'll be other chambers, other chapels, and shrine rooms within that monastery with tertiary deities, right? Or deity. And then all of these other subsidiary rooms and chapels with secondary and tertiary deities. And then further still, when you go out, this area right here, this is the courtyard. It's actually open air. You can't tell because this is the wall, but it's actually open air, and then the inside of the monastery starts here. There are these amazing murals that coat the entire wall of the courtyard inside the monastery that represent all of the, what would you say, the protector deities on the outskirts of the mandala. So they're not technically in the mandala, they're kind of outside of it, protecting it against evil. So they're very wrathful often, the way they're portrayed, and they're very fierce, they're good warriors, and they are on the furthest extent of the mandala of this monastery. Right? So monasteries even represent these kind of sacred palaces or mandalas of individual deities. And again, there are hundreds of these. I only gave you 3 or so examples, but there are hundreds. They're all different in color, geometric pattern, deities at the center, deities on the outskirts, and they all have this kind of nuanced detail to it that a monk or a nun will have to memorize. It's extraordinary, the detail that goes through it. So to get back to the point, I was at Nechung Monastery doing research there in the fall of 2011, predominantly. And the pictures you're going to see are from November of that year when I was taking these. This mandala that they constructed, that I'll start to show, out of sand, this is the first one they've been able to build at this monastery for 10 years. They weren't allowed to for the decade prior to 2011. Suddenly the government, the Chinese government, certainly kind of allowed them to start doing it. But that's honestly what you have to do. You have to work off of the caprice of the Chinese government. Sometimes they'll ban something at a moment's notice, other times they'll open it up. And here, this monastery wasn't allowed for the longest time to build this mandala, but now, starting in 2011, they were allowed to. So, that's where we're at. I felt very fortunate to be able to see this at this moment. Right? This was very momentous. The mandala that they're building is called the Four-Armed Avalokiteshvara Mandala. Right? Chakshiba Cherezi Ginkor in Tibetan. Just means exactly that. So I already mentioned Avalokiteshvara as this bodhisattva of compassion, this enlightened being who is renowned, especially in Tibet, but in other Buddhist cultures as well, as being particularly potent, responding to the entreaties of devotees and disciples. Very compassionate figure. And what is even more, I think, special or important about it is that it is the four-armed Avalokiteshvara that the Dalai Lama is said to be an incarnation of, or an emanation of. So that is the particular. There's a lot of different forms of this one bodhisattva. Sometimes he's 1,000-armed with 11 heads. This particular iteration is four-armed. And it's that iteration, the four-armed Avalokiteshvara, that the Dalai Lama is said to be an emanation of. Yeah, so that's where his authority extends from. And so it's quite special that this monastery, which actually has a lot of historical connection to the Dalai Lama's government, is making a mandala for him, right, as an offering for him. So you can see, here's the starting process. The monks are gathered around. You'll get a better sense of the scope of this thing. It's a lot bigger than the one that was done at Stetson last semester. I'll show a picture of that, though. But you see, what they'll start doing is they will take string. In the traditional way that this is done is once they have an area or space laid out, they'll take string, they'll coat it in powder, and then they'll line it up very straight and create the lines on the board. That's where the yellow powder is coming from. So that's how they get those nice geometric patterns so cleanly. They just take string and they line it up, one side to the other. Yeah, and using the powder to create the lines even once they lift the string. It's that simple. So that's how they start creating the general pattern. Here they are, hard at work. A little bit further, again, I had to be kind of, I had to be selective because I have hundreds of these, and I had to pick the ones that I thought were most captivating. So we see the monks. You can see, again, just how big it is. There's about, what, 5 of them gathered around it. And what they'll start to do is, starting from the center, once they have all the lines that they have drawn out, and sometimes they'll also mark it in pen or pencil, they'll start at the center with the seed syllable. This particular one has the seed syllable of Avalokiteshvara at the center. So they'll start doing that with sand. And the other instrument is a solid rod, and there are ridges on the piper part as well. And then with the rod, you vibrate the rod gently over the pipe so that the sand grains fall out at a very steady pace. It takes a lot of practice. They were very kind. I was kind of their helper, where I would go get this colored sand that they needed from the box of sand outside the monastery and come bring it back to them. And so for that, they kind of let me watch, and they let me experiment with that a little bit. It's hard. It's very hard. So that's what they're doing. They're putting almost a grain at a time of colored sand down, starting in the center, and then filling out the inside, going further out, just like that visualization practice of starting in the center with the seed syllable and emanating out from there. They're illustrating that. They're showing that physically through colored sand. So this mandala is built up completely of colored sand. It takes days to even make a small one. This took them about 10 days. And it was unfortunate. I had to leave pretty much on the 9th day. I got to see the 9th day and then I had to leave unfortunately. So I didn't get to see them destroy it. That'll be the last phase that I'll explain. But you'll see just how ornate it is, and then, you know, they're all working together from various points. You can imagine just a gust of breath, or wind rather, or a breath will ruin it. It's very, very delicate. And so it takes a lot of practice to control their breathing and to also control the environment so that this is all indoors, so that helps. You don't have to worry about wind so much. But their breathing, you'll notice one of them even covers his mouth with a mask. So not all of them do. This is a form of meditation in and of itself. You can imagine the trance state it would almost produce by just concentrating on putting the colored sand down, on regulating your breath. All very central practices in meditation, right? Breath control and concentration and focus. So this, a sand mandala, is a weeks-long meditation practice. And then when it's done, there's an offering involved, and I'll get to that. But either way, we see how it's kind of extending from there, how it's growing. Here's a close-up of them. Sometimes, you know, for these big spaces of solid color, it's a lot easier, right? You can just kind of lay the sand down. But even still, you can't just throw it down there. That'll get clumpy. So they have to do it very, very gently so that it's a nice, even layer. Very, very gentle layer. Soft. Only a couple grains thick. It's actually incredibly thin how the sand lays on top of the board. But you get a little bit more of the detail, how they even outline the seed syllable with black. They're going to do the same thing with these other ones when they get to it. Very, very ornate. Here's another close-up. You see it's gotten a little bit more progress. You see the bowls of the individual colored sands that they're using. And you can also get a better sense of the board that it's on. It's actually on a platform that's about this high. And it's even covered, actually. You can kind of see the... Here's like one of the outposts, right? So it even has a roof on it. It's a little mandala chapel all its own in the main assembly hall of Nature Monastery, where the monks would chant their rituals. So it's always present. It's always absorbing that kind of mantric power whenever the monks are chanting in the assembly hall. There's another example of that. Here's a good close-up right here. You see how much it's grown. This was probably about 5 days in, yeah, give or take. And again, so now a lot of these have been outlined already. More detail. You see, it's not just a solid color anymore. They've added all this kind of flair to it, all these sort of flowy patterns that have to trace that out so ornately, even all the way into the antechamber of the foyers, you know, even right into here. So you can see just how delicate and ornate that is, all the details that required. Here's a good backup. So again, you can see a little bit more of the structure that they're using to support this. Right? It's very well. So you don't want to bang against it. I was very careful to sort of take a photo like this, you know, just so I wouldn't accidentally hit it. But it's actually very sturdy. So it's meant for that, but you still want to be careful. Again, you see how much more it's kind of grown out from there. All the monks are working at it. Now here's the thing. Any one monk will be working on this for 5 or 6 hours at a time. They're standing while doing this. And standing meditation, so I'm sure they also worked in shifts, because again, it can be very exhausting over time. Yeah. Here's a good close-up. You see how layered the sand is and how the grains fall, again, almost one at a time from the metal pipe, so that it creates these nice sort of cloud structures. Very ornate, a lot of great patterns to it. And the thing is, each one of these things, each one of these symbols represents some kind of Buddhist symbol. Right? It's some kind of Buddhist symbol. A lot of times what you'll see are one of the 8 auspicious symbols, which are very popular in Tibetan Buddhism, which you'll also see maybe are mythic beings, like these makaras, which are these kind of chimeric sea creatures that are very popular in Tibetan Buddhist architecture. There's a lot of great story in history just in the symbols alone, if you recognize it. Right? A lot of lotus flowers, right, of various shades and colors, also very symbolic. And the color of the flower is also important. Here we go. That is almost done. I think that's the 9th day, actually, right there. Look how gorgeous that is. I don't think, what I missed was, I believe they're going to fill out this too. So you can just imagine how much, they still have another day or two of work ahead of them. But you can see just how incredibly ornate it was. So not only then did they put all this lovely kind of lattice work inside the palace, but also in the garden around the palace, represented here. Sometimes it's a moat, sometimes it's a garden, it all depends. Then you have this lotus fence around it. That's what these represent, lotus petals. Then you have another barrier of white light. That's what it's supposed to represent, with all these auspicious symbols drawn in it. Here's a lotus. I believe that is a banner, a victory. No, I'm sorry, that's a parasol. And so you have all the 8 auspicious symbols in that white light boundary. Further out from there, you have an indestructible fence, or an indestructible border, represented by the Vajra. In the word Vajrayana, Vajra represents both a lightning bolt and a diamond. So it has the spontaneity of a lightning bolt, but it has the indestructibility of a diamond. So it represents both of these symbols wrapped into one. And the reason why it looks like that, if you're curious about that shape, it's supposed to actually represent a king's scepter. So again, there's sort of this political attachment still there in its symbols. Oh, am I almost up? Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, I'm good. And then finally, we have a fire fence. Multicolored rainbow, a rainbow fire fence. That's a good way of putting it, right? It's multicolored, but it's a rainbow. All these different colors representing how indestructible, how invulnerable the palace of the enlightened being is. So it has all of this special symbolism, and then you'll have, filling out this area, they'll add even more kind of lovely shapes as well as different deities. Okay, to end up, I think I've only got like 4 or 5 slides, so it shouldn't be too bad. Just to give an example of one that was done recently, this is the Peace Mandala that was done at Stetson University last semester. We had some monks from, Tibetan monks from South India, a monastery called Gendon Shartse Dokham, coming to Stetson. They were doing a tour around the country, actually, and it was just fortuitous that the woman who was their kind of ambassador, their liaison, she was a Stetson alum, and so she wanted to bring them, and so we thought, okay, that sounds good to us. And so they created this mandala. You can tell, in contrast to the one that you just saw from Nechu Monastery, how much smaller this is. It's about the quarter of a size, and because of that, it only took them about 5 days. Still a lot of work. That's still them working 10 hours a day on this in shifts. But you notice it's very different. You don't have symbols, you don't have seed syllables in the center. You have the 8 auspicious symbols represented by this lotus petal, and then you have another lotus flower in the middle, and then you have much simpler borders, a fire boundary, an adamantine boundary, and then the 4 directions represented by 4 different colors. And this is it's called a Shiva Ginkor, which is a peace mandala. It's built and offered in order to instill peace in the world. So they all are made for different reasons. The one we saw previously at Nechu Monastery, that was made as an offering to 4-armed Avalokiteshvara, right, as a sort of subtle offering to the Dalai Lama, especially since that's illegal in Tibet. This is made more generically as an offering of peace, not only for the local community, the campus, but also the surrounding area, right, Central Florida, and even the world in general. And so it emanates out from that. All right, so that was we were fortunate enough to have that done at our campus last semester. So everyone got some sand. They weren't able to carry on, and it was fine. It was your decision. You can do it either way. But they weren't able to carry on to the next general phase, which is what sand remains is then poured out into a nearby body of water. If it can be a river so that carries it off further, that's great. But if not, a pond or a lake works just as well, like we see here. The idea is then the blessings accrued, sort of charged in those sand particles, touch whatever living beings are in that water. And again, it radiates out. The blessings radiate out into the world as an offering of empowerment, you might say. So that's exactly what happens once they're done. So as detailed and as much work was put into this, it's ultimately destroyed as a representation of this core Buddhist concept of impermanence. One of the root teachings of Buddhism is impermanence. It's been there since the beginning. It's one of the first things that the Buddha taught. Actually, it was the first thing that the Buddha taught. In the Four Noble Truths, one of the sufferings of the world is impermanence, that everything changes, no matter what. There's nothing we can do to stop that. Everything passes, everything ages, everything changes. Right? That is a core Buddhist belief. And the mandala and its impermanence embodies that in a very almost visceral way. You see something that beautiful and ornate being destroyed, it hits you a little bit, right? It certainly hits me. And yet that's exactly the point, right? That's the beauty of it. That impermanence is what makes it so beautiful. And so the monks embody this as part of their meditation. One last thing, I know I got like 1 minute left. So one last iteration of the mandala I want to share with you, just to be comprehensive, are what are called ratna mandalas, jewel mandalas. These are physical rings. You see it here, not filled. And then what they'll do is in monasteries and sometimes on family altars in Tibetan homes, they'll fill it with rice. They'll fill the first ring with rice. Then they'll put the second ring up there, resting on the rice. They'll fill that second ring with rice. Put the third layer, and you see it there being constructed. So it also presents like a palace. But in this case, the rice grains are made as an offering to the enlightened being. Right? So these are offering mandalas. They're meant to give to the enlightened deity, and through that to the community at large, as a way of accruing good merit, good karma. Again, another very central Buddhist concept, good karma. All right, so that's what these ratna mandalas. So we see again, kind of get back to the whole point, mandalas in so many different iterations in terms of these brass offerings, in terms of the Tonka paintings, in terms of the sand mandala, but they all serve this multivalent purpose of meditation, of impermanence, of representing a Buddhist mind, almost a Buddhist universe in its own little world, a palace, an enlightened palace with a lot of regal symbolism attached to it, and also as a source of meditation. It represents all these things simultaneously. It's not just one of these things, it's all of them. Right? And so in its root, that's what a Tibetan Buddhist mandala is all about.
Thank you.